spoken at every clarity conference except the last one in Portugal. I'm sick, but Kinetic Sheep kindly delivered my remarks anyway. So I've talked about, among other things, the myths, the bedevil, plain language, I talked about my own empirical testing of legal documents. I talked about my efforts to collect and summarize all the empirical evidence for the benefits of plain language, and I've called that writing for dollars, writing to please. Of course, I did an early version of that in the mid-90s. Talked about my work on the federal rules of civil procedure, the federal rules of evidence in the U.S., and then there were a couple of master class drafting sessions at a couple of the conferences. So I've about exhausted my small bag of subjects. And I thought I would just relax and look back a little bit at the history of plain language. So this will not be deep. This is just for fun. So the first category is publications. David Mellenkoff's book, The Language of the Law, really the intellectual foundation for plain legal language in the United States. Exploded all the myths about traditional legal style. He called the argument from precision the most spurious argument of all, that legal language is somehow especially more precise than traditional legal style. Richard White's book, Plain English for Lawyers, it was there first for lawyers in the late 1970s. 800,000 copies now in print. Immodestly, the plain language column in the Michigan Bar Journal, which has been around now for 25 years. Write this down. Now you should note this down. You should Google plain language column index. Plain language column index. And you will get the index to all the plain language. So it's a gold mine of writing and research information about plain language. For the last 25 years, you get the index and links. We don't have some of the older columns online, but the more recent columns are all online. Rudolph Flesch's books and readability formulas. I understand the controversy surrounding readability formulas, but they have been influential and they deserve to be mentioned. In Canada, the Canadian Bar Association, Canadian Bankers Association report the decline and fall of gobbledygook. I've got a question mark after that one. I haven't got a good handle yet on how influential that actually was. It was high profile, but I don't know what kind of concrete results it actually produced. In the UK, Ernest Gower's book, Plain Words, right, was really probably the first how-to manual in the 1950s, how to write in plain language. The Renton Report on Legislation in the UK, Eamon Moran assures me that that was important, and he has agreed to write that summary. And in Australia, Michelle Asprey's book, Plain Language for Lawyers, now in its 4th edition. It's had great influence really worldwide. What about laws and rules? In the United States, New York's plain English law was the first. The first, at least in the U.S., the first statutory requirement that consumer contracts be written in plain language, consumer contracts generally. The SEC in the mid-1990s, late 1990s, the Securities and Exchange Commission's plain English rules requiring investment disclosure documents to be in plain English. And as part of that project, they produced the SEC's Plain English Handbook, which Bill Lutz had a strong hand in writing. Right, available free. You should, this is a freebie. You should download this one from the Securities and Exchange website. The U.S. Securities and Exchange SEC website. The Plain Writing Act of 2010, which you heard all about yesterday from Annetta. The European Union, the Unfair Contracts Terms Directive, which I'm told was significant in the EU, and Martin Cutts has agreed to write that summary. South Africa, let's see, I got to go down. South Africa. The Consumer Protection Act in South Africa, which Candace Burke is going to write about and talked about yesterday. See how timely this conference is? See how timely and relevant this conference is? And the South African Constitution, which was maybe the first of any constitutions that tried to follow plain language principles. What about projects and activities? This is the third category. We've got publications, laws and rules, projects and activities. In the United States, the Citibank loan note made a big splash in the late 1970s. It was probably the first commercial document, high-profile commercial document, at least in the U.S., that was written in plain language. Got a lot of attention across the country. Again, immodestly, the restyled federal court rules. These rules will govern all procedure in all the U.S. federal courts. And there have now been 4 sets of U.S. federal court rules. They call it restyled, redrafted into plain, or at least as plain as they would let us make it, language. That's another story. That's been the last 10 years of my life. In Canada, perhaps the Department of Justice Access to Justice program. Again, I need to know more about this. Also in Canada, the training, there's been extensive training in the provincial securities commissions done by wordsmith, Christine Moak, and she's going to write about that project. She has written about that project. In the UK, the Civil Procedure Rules of 1998, which are sort of the counterpart to item number 16, the restyling of the U.S. federal court rules. I believe those will be make a nice parallel. In the United Kingdom, the tax rewrite project, which has been going on for this complete rewrite of the tax laws, which has been going on for many years. There was another big forms project in the UK in the 1980s. They rewrote, they simplified 15,000 forms, improved another 21,000 forms. Great cost savings from that. This was carried on under the Thatcher government. In Norway, the Civil Service Project, that summary is in, thanks to Sissel and Turin. In Portugal, government summary, Sandra. I'm waiting for your summary. In Australia, the NRMA, that's the National Road Motorists Association car insurance policy. That was sort of the counterpart to the item number 15, the Citibank loan note in the U.S. That was like the first big major commercial document rewritten into plain language in Australia in the 1970s. The trend in major, the Australian law firms have been out front, at least in English-speaking countries, have been out front in committing explicitly to the plain language drafting. And Christopher Bamford has written that summary. The format of New South Wales legislation was pretty important in Australia, I believe, and influential. I'm waiting for that summary. Now, organizations, my last category. In the U.S., the legendary Document Design Center did some terrific research in plain language. One of the first really research-based plain language organizations in the United States in the late 70s and early 80s. And Jenny Reddish, who was deeply involved in that, you've heard her name, and has written that a summary of the Document Design Center. The Federal Employee Plain Language Group, the Clinton Gore Initiatives, which again you heard about yesterday from Annetta. The Center for Plain Language, one of the big 3, at least in the English-speaking world, one of the big 3. Center for Plain Language, Plain and Clarity. And then in Canada, of course, Plain, which is why we're here today. Folks, you need to be a member of Plain. If you are interested in plain language, you need to belong to Plain and Clarity. It's $100 US a year total for both. Okay, and you can now sign up online for either or both organizations. Again, in Canada, the Canadian Law Information Council, the Plain Language Center, it's called CLIC back in the days, the late 80s and early 90s, was a huge repository of literature about plain language. In Quebec, possibly the government, voluntary government group for simplification of communications. I need to learn more about that. In Clarity, the United Kingdom was founded in Clarity. Now, of course, it's very much international. Our biggest international group, right? The big two international groups, of course, are Plain and Clarity. The Plain English Campaign and the Plain Language Commission, the early grassroots advocacy organizations in the late 1970s, founded, of course, by Christy Maher and Martin Cutts. Martin Cutts has since gone on to found the Plain Language Commission. In Europe, Frank Fogg. In Sweden, our hero models, the Ministry of Justice, the Linguistic Division. I was glad to see Barbara here today. I'm going to try to twist her arm and see if she'll write that summary, or at least put me in touch with somebody who will write that summary. In Australia, again, the legendary Law Reform Commission of Victoria. I mean, they did a monumental report in the late 80s, early 90s. You know, Christopher Mountford was a part of that. Eamon Moran was a part of that. Robert Eagleson, many of the familiar names in plain language. In Australia, the Centre for Plain Legal Language at the University of Sydney, 1990 to 1996. In New Zealand, the Law Reform Commission of New Zealand did some excellent work in plain language legislation and with some very good publications. And in New Zealand, the Clearmark Award, founded by Linda Harris. So you'll notice that I have 41. Either something's got to go or the list has to get longer. So you help me with that, okay? What have I missed? What needs to be added? What maybe have I overrated? What lessons from this? The lessons, it seems to me, are obvious to the point of being trite, really. But they are, first, that a group of committed, connected, persistent, dedicated advocates can make things happen. You know, when this all started in the 1970s, we were all flying solo, right? And making it up as we went along, you know, doing things on our own. And now look, we have 2 international organizations, an active listserv sponsored by Plain, a plain language journal, Clarity, and a conference every other year. I mean, it's remarkable how much has happened in these years. This dedicated group, though, point number 2, must enlist support from the top and the bottom. Support from the top comes and goes. Right? But every project leaves its mark, leaves its publications, its revisions, its research, and its comments. They stay involved and they move on to other projects. And these projects show the way for the next projects. And someday, maybe, we'll get to critical mass. But we also need support and pressure from the grassroots. We saw in Martin Cutts' presentation yesterday. I mean, a little complaining can do some good. Plain language is a citizen's right. Plain language can save enormous amounts of time and money, and we need to keep driving home that message. I noticed just the other day that the Center for Plain Language now has over 1,000 followers on its Twitter account. See? Well, there you go. And finally, the next generation of lawyers needs to step up and carry on this good fight. It's great to see so many young faces. Of course, you know, as years go by, everybody starts to look young. But it's good to see so many young faces in the audience. But we need more. We need to find ways to instill in a new international contingent of advocates the same passion that we veterans have always felt for plain language. And I guess That will always be our challenge, right? Keep on, as an old hippie would say, keep on keeping on. Okay, that's it.